Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're grabbing a shovel, metaphorically speaking, and digging deep into some foundational philosophy. It asks a really fundamental question: what actually makes us tick?
Yeah, we've got these excerpts from a truly classic text in Western thought, and they offer some surprising, maybe even a little unsettling answers about human nature.
Definitely surprising. Forget dry lectures, folks. Our mission today is really to guide you through these potent ideas.
Exactly. We want to pull out the essential insights,
Hmm.
show you why a philosopher writing centuries ago still has so much to tell you about your feelings, your moral compass, the world you live in.
We're going for the nuggets that stick.
That's the plan.
Okay, let's jump straight in. The source starts by looking inward, kind of sorting through our internal experiences. It talks about different kinds of impressions,
Right.
feelings.
There are the intense ones, like the text says, raptures of poetry and music, which it calls less violent, interestingly.
And then there are the passions proper,
Exactly. And these passions are where things get really interesting. The source splits them into two main camps. You've got the direct passions,
like desire, aversion, joy, fear, that kind of thing.
pretty much hope, despair, the straightforward emotional responses. But then there are the indirect passions.
Okay.
And these are more complex, sort of built out of the simpler ones.
Hmm.
Things like pride, humility, love,
Hmm.
hatred, envy, pity. And this is where a lot of the deep analysis really happens.
And here's where we hit a really key concept right away, maybe a bit counterintuitive. How do these complex indirect passions actually work?
Well, the source proposes a specific mechanism, something it calls a double relation of ideas and impressions.
Double relation. Okay, break that down.
Think of it like this. For an indirect passion to fire up, you need two things to connect, two links. First, a link in your ideas. Your mind has to connect the object of the passion, say a person or a thing, to whatever is causing the feeling.
Hmm.
Second, there has to be a link in your impressions, your feelings. The sensation produced by the cause, pleasure or uneasiness, has to be similar in feel to the sensation that defines the passion itself.
So like connects with like. Pleasure links to pride, which feels good. Unease links to humility, which feels bad.
Exactly. When both those relations line up, relating the idea of the cause to the object, and relating the feeling from the cause to the feeling of the passion, that's when the passion sparks. It's kind of mental wiring diagram for complex feelings.
That's fascinating. And it immediately gets applied to really personal feelings, right? Like pride and humility.
Right away, the source zeroes in, saying these particular passions are always directed towards self.
That connected succession of perceptions, as he puts it, what you think of as you.
But, and this is crucial, it's not just the self itself that triggers pride or humility.
No.
No, it's qualities or circumstances that are related to the self. And those qualities have to produce either pleasure, which then sparks pride, or uneasiness, which leads to humility.
The examples in the text are so vivid and honestly kind of relatable even now.
They really are.
Things like having a talent for pleasing people or wit, good humor, personal merit, beauty, riches.
But also things just connected to you, like the quality of your wine, your cooking, your servants.
Even the healthfulness of the air where you live or how fertile your land is. He mentions feeling mortified if you try to please someone and fail.
And that principle that the cause must be related to you for pride or humility to kick in is absolutely central.
He gives that great example, right, about the adventure.
Yeah, the striking one. If you have a surprising, thrilling adventure, you feel pride. But if you just hear about someone else having the exact same adventure,
Even if it's exciting to hear about.
right, even if it gives you pleasure listening, you don't feel pride yourself.
Yeah.
Because that experience isn't related to yourself. The connection isn't there.
So that raises a question he touches on. Why aren't we usually bursting with pride about being healthy or totally crushed by a common cold?
Well, the source speculates maybe it's because things like health aren't peculiar enough to just one person, or maybe they aren't constant enough over time to get strongly linked to that stable idea of self. It's a bit fuzzy.
Interesting. And then there's comparison.
Ah, yes, comparison. The text explicitly says comparing yourself with others is a sure method of augmenting our esteem of anything, especially something like power.
Like the rich man comparing himself to a beggar.
Exactly. That comparison dramatically increases his satisfaction with his own situation. It's like a mental amplifier for these feelings.
Okay, so that's pride and humility, looking inward. What about when these feelings point outward, towards other people?
The source shifts right there to love and hatred,
Yeah.
and it presents them as using essentially the same mechanism as pride and humility.
Just aimed differently.
Precisely. Pointed at another person instead of yourself.
And the causes can be just as varied.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just like with pride. It could be someone's virtue, their knowledge, wit, beauty, physical abilities.
But also external stuff related to them, like their possessions.
Yes, like owning a beautiful house, for instance. Or even qualities of things related to them.
And that double relation is still the engine driving it.
Still the core mechanism. You relate the idea of the agreeable or disagreeable thing, the house, the virtue, the flaw, to the person who's the object of your love or hatred.
Okay.
And then the feeling produced by that thing, the pleasure or uneasiness,
Mm-hmm.
relates to the actual feeling of love or hatred itself.
That example about the palace next door makes sense now.
Right. The person looking out the window respects you less if that amazing palace isn't yours, because the pleasure from the palace isn't linked to you by the idea of ownership. So it doesn't generate that positive feeling directed at you.
The text also distinguishes between actions and qualities, doesn't it?
It does. It makes the point that someone's actions influence our love or hatred most strongly when they seem to come from a consistent character, a stable principle in them.
Not just a random impulse.
Exactly. But interestingly, even involuntary qualities like, say, physical deformity or just a lack of cleverness can cause aversion if just encountering them creates a feeling of uneasiness in us.
Mm. And this leads us somewhere really central, you said.
Yes, arguably the linchpin for a lot of this. Sympathy. The philosopher uses that wonderful phrase, minds of men are mirrors to one another.
Mirrors.
Sympathy is the mechanism. It's how we enter into the opinions and feelings of others. It makes their inner states vivid and present for us.
Ah, so this explains a lot. Like why being around people can feel good.
Yes, it helps explain why company, even with strangers, is briefly agreeable. Their presence sort of enlivens ideas of various passions in us through sympathy.
And familiar things.
It explains why we tend to prefer familiar objects too. Custom makes them more agreeable, strengthens their relation to us, and then enhances our sympathetic response to them or things associated with them.
Okay, connecting these threads. Pity and envy come next. How does sympathy play into pity?
Pity is framed as a secondary passion, one that arises from sympathy. Our basic resemblance to all other humans, or just them being near us, makes their experiences, especially suffering, feel lively for us through sympathy.
So we feel with them.
We feel with them. And there's that striking observation he makes, maybe a bit dated now, about women and children perhaps being more subject to pity, guided more by imagination.
Yeah, I noticed that.
But what's really fascinating psychologically is the point that pity can sometimes be stronger when the person suffering doesn't show the expected emotion.
How does that work?
Like lamenting someone who's clearly facing misfortune but isn't outwardly dejected. Our imagination, guided by the general rule that misfortune should cause sadness, kind of fills in the blank and creates the feeling of pity in us, even without the usual outward cues from the person.
Wow, okay. And envy, also linked to sympathy.
Envy is sparked by others' superiority, but it's not necessarily about sympathy. The interesting point here is about proximity.
Right. It's not always the biggest gap that causes the most envy.
Exactly. A foot soldier envies his sergeant much more intensely than he envies the general far above him. A writer feels more envy towards a direct rival than towards, say, Shakespeare.
It's the close comparison again.
That close competition seems to heighten the feeling.
And speaking of superiority, our esteem for the rich and powerful. How does that fit?
The source argues this is actually a form of love, or at least related to it. It comes from our sympathy with the satisfaction that their power and riches presumably give them.
So we're kind of sharing in their pleasure.
We enter into that feeling through, as he puts it, the vivacity of the fancy. We imagine their satisfaction, and that sympathetic imagination creates a positive feeling of esteem in us.
And this extends beyond just wealth and power to things like utility.
Yes, things like the fertility of land, the strength of a horse, even human health, or things we might just see as useful or physically good. The source says we judge them agreeable or even beautiful, partly because of their tendency to produce pleasure or utility.
And we appreciate that tendency how?
Through sympathy again. We sympathize with the potential pleasure or usefulness, whether it's for the owner, for society, or just in general. That sympathetic appreciation makes the quality itself seem agreeable to us.
Okay, this is a huge chunk focused on feelings and how they work, but then the source makes a really significant philosophical turn, right, towards morality.
A massive pivot. After digging into the mechanics of feelings, it tackles one of the biggest questions. Where do our moral distinctions come from? Virtue, vice, good, bad.
And the answer is pretty radical for its time.
Extremely. The claim is bold. Moral distinctions are not derived from reason alone.
Whoa, okay. not from reason. Then where?
From what the source calls a moral sense, which is described quite simply as a feeling,
A
sentiment.
feeling.
Yeah. When you observe a character trait or an action, it produces a particular feeling of pleasure or approval or uneasiness or disapproval in you. And that feeling is what constitutes your sense of virtue or vice. It's more like internal taste than a logical conclusion.
Okay, but why can't reason be the source? What's the argument against reason running the moral show?
The argument is pretty specific about what reason actually does. Reason's job is to deal with truth and falsehood.
Right, like math or logic.
Exactly. It judges whether our ideas match reality, whether they agree or disagree with facts or with other ideas. But the source argues passions, feelings, acts of will, and the actions that follow, they aren't representations of anything else. They're just original facts. They simply exist.
So they can't be true or false.
Not in themselves. An action isn't a statement about the world that can be true or false. Since they aren't true or false, they can't be inherently reasonable or unreasonable in the way a factual belief can be.
So when we say someone acted unreasonably,
According to this view, that usually means their action was based on a false judgment about the situation, like fearing something harmless because you mistakenly believe it's dangerous, or it means they used really ineffective means to achieve their goal. But the core passion itself, the desire or the aversion, isn't judged by reason directly. Reason deals with truth. Passions deal with feelings and impulses.
this distinction then between reason and sentiment, it leads to another really crucial separation, doesn't it? Between types of virtues.
Yes, the distinction between natural and artificial virtues. Some virtues, like maybe kindness or benevolence, might feel quite natural, like they spring directly from our sentiments.
Okay.
But the source makes the highly controversial case that others, and this is key, especially justice and the rules about property, are artificial.
Artificial, meaning man-made.
But essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They arise from human convention, from a kind of collective agreement or social artifice, not from a direct natural instinct or feeling in the same way benevolence might.
That's a big claim. How does that origin story for society and justice work then?
Well, in this view, it starts with basic necessity. Humans are individually pretty weak. We need society to survive and thrive. It increases our strength, our abilities, our security.
Makes sense.
The problem is, our natural passions, especially that insatiable, perpetual, universal desire for possessions he mentioned earlier, make living together peacefully really, really difficult. We're naturally inclined to grab things for ourselves and our close connections.
So justice isn't some internal principle we discover out there.
Not according to this source. It's not seen as some natural instinct strong enough on its own to control our selfishness. Instead, justice is a convention. It's an agreement, maybe implicit at first, that we kind of stumble into or consciously adopt.
Why?
Because we realize collectively that our long-term self-interest is actually better served by restraining our immediate greed and agreeing on stable rules for who owns what.
Like the guys rowing the boat.
Exactly. That's the analogy used. Two people rowing a boat coordinate their strokes by convention, by a shared understanding of mutual benefit, not because there's some natural law of rowing or because they made a formal promise beforehand. Justice arises similarly from a sense of common interest and stability.
Okay, so the need for rules comes from self-interest. But what about the specific rules of property themselves? Are they purely rational outcomes?
This is another really surprising twist in the argument. The source argues no, not entirely. While the foundation is interest, the specific rules we end up with are often shaped by, well, imagination or the more frivolous properties of our thought.
Imagination, shaping fundamental rules like property. That sounds odd.
It does sound odd, but think about the examples given. How do we decide who owns something?
Well, finding it first. Occupation.
Right, occupation is one, though he critiques the simple idea that just mixing your labor with something automatically makes it yours. Then there's long possession prescription. If you've had it for ages, it seems right that it's yours.
Okay, that makes sense.
And accession. This is where imagination really comes in. Small things are seen to follow larger ones, like the fruit belongs to the owner of the tree. But he points out, we wouldn't say a huge river like the Rhine belongs to the owner of the bank it touches, just because land is generally bigger than water. Because, the source suggests, our imagination finds the connection between a great river and a whole nation more natural or fitting than connecting it just to one piece of land. It's about what feels right to our associative minds, not pure logic. He even notes how legal rules sometimes seem inconsistent, showing they arise from different imaginative principles, not just deduction.
So convention and imagination are really powerful forces here. Does this apply to promises too?
Absolutely. Promises are presented as having no natural binding force either. There's nothing inherent in the act of saying, I promise, that creates an obligation out of thin air.
So why do we feel obligated? Why do they work?
Purely human convention again. We collectively create the rule, the understanding, that promises must be kept. Why? Because we recognize that so much of human cooperation trade, complex projects, social life depends on being able to rely on others' word. Fidelity serves our mutual interest.
But the feeling of obligation seems real.
The source suggests the very idea of being able to will an obligation into existence just by uttering words is a kind of philosophical fiction. It's a concept we invent and agree upon because the convention is so useful, not because it reflects some deep natural reality.
Okay, given all this are tricky passions, the artificial nature of justice, where does government fit into the picture?
Government becomes necessary because, frankly, we humans are often bad at prioritizing. We struggle to consistently choose the long-term general interest represented by justice when it conflicts with our immediate personal desires or biases.
We favor the near over the far.
Exactly. So magistrates or rulers who are ideally less personally invested in every single dispute and have a broader view are established to enforce the general rules of justice more impartially and consistently.
And our duty to obey the government, our allegiance, does that come from some kind of original social contract, like a promise we all made?
The source argues strongly against that popular idea. Allegiance, just like justice itself, isn't ultimately founded on a promise.
Then what?
Its foundation is the very same thing, the public interest. We obey because we recognize that maintaining society and order, which benefits us all, requires submitting to authority. And interestingly, just like with property, the passage of time, long possession of power by a ruling family or system, greatly strengthens that government's authority in people's minds. Again, it's the power of custom and imagination solidifying the convention.
So the core argument is that morals, justice, even political obligation stem from feelings, utility, convention, imagination, not pure reason. Does this way of thinking extend beyond these big categories?
Yes, it broadens out quite significantly. The source includes things we might not normally class as moral virtues, like natural ability.
Your natural abilities, like what?
Things like prudence, good judgment, wit, eloquence. And even purely physical advantages, beauty, strength, vigor. These are also considered qualities that we approve of, almost like virtues.
Wait, so being witty or even just being good-looking is seen as virtuous in some sense?
In the sense that they are qualities that naturally draw our approval, yes. The basis for approving them is presented as very similar to moral virtues.
So
They give us pleasure when we observe them, either directly, agreeableness, or because we recognize their utility, their usefulness to the person who possesses them, or maybe to society. And again, this pleasure, this appreciation of utility or agreeableness is often felt through sympathy.
sympathy again, it just keeps popping up.
It's incredibly central to this whole framework. The text contrasts, say, judgment, which is highly esteemed for its clear utility, with something like memory, which is seen as useful but perhaps less directly agreeable or impressive, so it gets less virtuous approval.
It really drives home how much rests on this idea of shared feeling.
It really does. The source emphasizes that even virtues that seem useful only to strangers still affect us and gain our approval through sympathy. It becomes a cornerstone for understanding a huge part of how we evaluate people and their qualities.
Okay, we've journeyed through the inner world of feelings, the structures of society, and morality. But the source material, or rather the philosopher's broader work, also tackles even bigger questions, right? About the universe, God.
Yes, based on other parts of the work, the deep dive touches on those ultimate questions too. It presents the classic argument from design.
The watchmaker argument, basically.
Sort of. Look at the intricate order in the world, how parts seem to fit together purposefully, like a machine or a well-designed house. The argument is that this resemblance to human creations implies that the cause of the world, God, must resemble the cause of human creations, namely a mind and intelligence, but, infinitely greater, a divine designer.
But the source doesn't just present it, it critiques it pretty heavily.
Oh, absolutely. It lays out some powerful criticisms. First, the analogy itself is weak. Well, the world also resembles a living organism, a plant or an animal, which grows and reproduces through natural processes, not conscious design. So maybe the cause is more like generation or vegetation than intelligent planning. Plus, applying human-like mental qualities like thinking or having intentions to an infinite, unique being is really problematic. Can we even conceive of that coherently?
And the evidence from the world itself, does it support a perfect designer?
That's the other major line of critique. Finite, imperfect effects, which is what the world seems to be, can't logically prove infinite or perfect attributes in the cause. A limited outcome doesn't require an unlimited source.
And it doesn't even prove one designer.
Exactly. Maybe there were multiple designers, maybe they were apprentices, maybe they bungled the job. The evidence doesn't force the conclusion of a single perfect creator.
And then there's the biggest challenge, evil.
Right. This is a heavy point. The undeniable existence of both natural evil, pain, disease, earthquakes, all the suffering built into the natural order and moral evil, human cruelty. Injustice poses a profound challenge to the idea of a creator who is both all-powerful and perfectly good, at least in a way we understand goodness. The force details things like our very capacity for pain, the way general laws inevitably cause collateral damage, the fact we have limited abilities, and the often messy execution of natural processes. It's a sobering look at the world's imperfections.
There's also a quick, sharp observation about religion's actual effects on society, isn't there?
Yes, a rather pointed one. It notes that what he calls vulgar superstition, popular, often unthinking religious belief and practice, frequently leads to conflict, division, and persecution.
And doesn't necessarily make people more moral.
Often not, according to this observation. It can lead people to prioritize trivial rituals or dogmas over genuine virtue like kindness or honesty. And for many adherents, it's more often a source of fear and anxiety than comfort or moral guidance.
Okay, almost wrapping up. The source touches on a couple of final, really deep philosophical knots. Things philosophers still wrestle with. One is the idea of the self.
Right. He brings up that famous difficulty. When you look inward introspectively, can you actually find a single, simple, constant impression of self or substance?
And the conclusion is,
He suggests you can't. All you find are particular perceptions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, constantly changing and succeeding each other. This leads to the challenging idea that maybe personal identity isn't some underlying, unchanging core thing. Maybe it's more like the succession itself, the chain of connected perceptions.
a bundle of perceptions.
That's the famous phrase often associated with it, yes. A bundle or collection linked by memory and causation.
And the nature of belief itself gets a similar treatment. Not just a thought, but a feeling.
Yes. Belief isn't simply entertaining an idea in your mind. It's having a particular feeling or sentiment attached to that idea, which makes it feel real or forceful.
And you don't choose to believe.
This feeling isn't usually voluntary. It arises naturally from certain causes, like when an idea gets extra vividness or force because it's linked to something you're currently experiencing, a present impression. It's less about rationally deciding something is true and more about how vividly and strongly you feel it to be true.
And I liked the little moment of self-correction mentioned.
Yes, it's a nice touch. Shows the philosopher refining his own views. He apparently admitted an earlier mistake where he thought judging distance was a matter of reason, but came to see that feeling or immediate sensation was closer to the truth. It shows it's an ongoing process.
Wow. That was quite an intellectual workout. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of how our feelings work, how pride and love get generated.
Through that double relation mechanism.
Right. To the really surprising idea that things we think are fundamental, like justice and property, might actually be human inventions, artifices born out of necessity, shaped by imagination.
And then wrestling with the limits of reason when it comes to morality, the nature of the world, even God. Finding some really challenging questions there.
What seems to consistently emerge from this whole deep dive is this philosopher's radical reliance on, well, on feelings. Sentiments, imagination, sympathy, custom, convention, these are the bedrock.
Exactly. They're presented as the foundation for understanding so much of human life. Our morals, our social rules, even how we form beliefs, often pushing back hard against the idea that pure abstract reason is the main driver or the ultimate authority.
It definitely offers a powerful, maybe even, unsettling perspective on ourselves. It gives these unexpected explanations for why society is the way it is, why we feel the way we do, why we approve or disapprove of things.
So here's something to maybe chew on as you go about your day, interacting with people, making judgments. If our sense of right and wrong, if the rules holding society together, if even our deepest convictions about the universe are so fundamentally woven from our feelings, our shared agreements, and the peculiar ways our minds link ideas through sympathy and imagination.
Now what?
Well, what does that really mean for the dream of finding universal, unchanging moral laws? Or for the hope of grasping the absolute truth about reality, or the nature of God, using logic and reason alone.
Hmm. Plenty to think about there. We really hope this deep dive has given you some genuinely valuable insights, maybe shifted your perspective a bit.
Keep that curiosity alive.